on the podcast, we have Michael Lynton, one of America's leading CEOs. Michael led Sony Entertainment as CEO, overseeing Sony's global entertainment businesses. It was a period of remarkable success, but also had some serious challenges, notably when North Korean hackers released private emails and unreleased films. Michael had previously led Time Warner International as president and was CEO of Penguin, where he extended the publisher into music and the internet.
But our focus today is on Michael's role as a mentor. He has been arguably one of the most successful startup mentors of all time, discovering and nurturing a young Evan Spiegel, the founder of Snapchat. Michael spotted Evan after Michael's wife contacted Snapchat customer support in a moment of serendipity. From that chance encounter, Michael went on to become chairman of Snap, now one of the world's largest social media platforms.
We're going to find out from Michael what truly great mentorship looks like, what you should look for in a mentor, and how the relationship changes as the company scales. We're also going to hear from Michael on his own experience on what great leadership looks like, and particularly how decision-making works at the very top.
Michael, you've had an extraordinary career as a CEO. You rose to become CEO of Penguin and then Sony Entertainment. What role did mentors play in your ascent? And once you made it to the top jobs, what did you learn about mentorship from them?
I think the thing that people don't necessarily understand until you actually become a CEO is that it is a remarkably solitary and lonely job. And it's one where you are required on many occasions to make the decision, because that's why the actual choice comes to you. It's somehow been laddered up to you. And in those moments, you really do need to be able to reach out to somebody and ask them their opinion, or certainly you do need to do that on occasion. And I had the benefit of that in both instances, both at Penguin and then later at Sony. At Penguin, it was my predecessor, Peter Mayer, who I was very, very close to, had run Penguin incredibly successfully for 20 years. And he was somebody I relied on to sort of tell me in those moments what I should be thinking about. And then later on, when I was at Sony, my boss, Howard Stringer. So Howard Stringer was also very much a mentor for me.
You discovered Snapchat founder Evan Spiegel in LA. It's a fantastic story. It's sort of famous in startup folklore at this point. But we'd love to hear in your words how that all started, how that relationship began.
Yeah, sure. So we were, it was about 11, 12 years ago, and we were living on the west side of LA at the time. I today live in New York City, although we still have the house there. And Snapchat started on the west side of LA. That's where Evan was living and actually had gone to high school. As a result, my 3 kids were all using Snapchat at the time. The service wasn't nearly the size it is at the moment. And I started to use it so that I could communicate with them. And my wife noticed it, and she admired the fact that the messages and the images disappeared. Her concern at the time, and still remains that, is this idea of permanence on the internet and how that, came to harm people who had inadvertently put stuff up, but had had to live with the results of it for the rest of their lives. And so she saw this, and she actually wrote over customer service, and we still have the printout of it, a note to Evan, saying how much she admired the service. And particularly, I remember this, she also was a great admirer of the way that the terms of service for Snap had been written. She thought it was written, and she was right, in an incredibly straightforward and simple manner so that anybody could understand it. In any event, she wrote over customer service, and she almost got an immediate response, primarily because Evan himself was handling customer service at the time. And she invited him over, and he came over to the house that night. And I was over in the corner reading the newspaper, and the two of them basically spent the next 2 hours talking about what Evan wanted to do with Snapchat, what his ambitions were. And at one point, I think it was Jamie asked him, how could I be helpful? And he said, well, we're looking to raise a little bit more money. And to my surprise, quite candidly, Jamie said, oh, I would love to be able to invest with you. So that's how it all started to get rolling. As it turned out, Snap's offices were about a mile and a half down the road from the movie studio where I worked in Culver City. They were in Venice. And Evan would at that point come and see me sort of once a month, maybe a little bit more often. And we would, at the end of the day, walk around the studio lot, and Evan would talk to me or ask me questions about various issues he was confronting. And that sort of was the start of the relationship, frankly. And Evan and I became very close. But in truth, Evan was very close with not just me, my wife, my 3 daughters. He was virtually became a member of our family and still remains that way.
Wow, that's an incredible story. And I think your wife could make an amazing venture capitalist if she wanted to as well.
Others have said that.
And was there something, in the early days, you obviously had a very busy schedule. Was there something about Evan that made you want to mentor him? Or was it just, the product and Snapchat's traction? Or was the fact that your wife was, enamored with the product? What was it about the situation that kind of led you to that mentorship role in essence?
Right. So first of all, I should say I'm not entirely comfortable with the idea of a mentor or a mentorship. I never talked about the 2 people I mentioned earlier, Peter Mayer and Howard. I never talked to them or thought of them as mentors. I thought of them as good friends and people who I would look to for guidance. And I think that's sort of the friendship that Evan and I put together or found ourselves in. What I saw in Evan is what you would want to see in a friend. I saw somebody who was very smart, very curious, able to talk about a lot of subjects and engage in them, and somebody with whom I could have a real back and forth. He was very impressive in terms of not just his vision for where he thought the internet or communications on the internet would go, but his ideas around how to be protecting people on the internet, which is Snap to this day continues to do that, was also impressive. And his integrity was impressive. So for all of those reasons, when he would call up and say, "Can I come over for an hour and take a walk with you?" I really looked forward to those walks. And I still look forward to getting together with Evan all the time.
Thank you.
How did that relationship work? And was it very structured? You mentioned him coming over for a walk and so on. Were you very intentional together in saying, "Look, let's get together once a week or once a month"? How did that work?
No, I don't think it was like that. I think it was much more, and sort of 11, 12 years on, it's not that different, although now we have board meetings and other things which have a certain structured rhythm to them. But in truth, it took on a cadence of its own. My memory, and I'm not sure my memory is entirely accurate, but my memory was it would be a couple of times a month. And typically Evan would just call over to the office and make some time, and we would do that. But equally, I remember very distinctly, and that still happens too, I would look down at my phone and there would be a text or a snap to say, "Do you have a minute to talk?" And that would just happen in the middle of the day or occasionally in the evening or on the weekends. So it was sort of structure. It fell into a certain rhythm, but there was no formal structure to it.
For other younger entrepreneurs who are listening to this and watching it, trying to understand how do you get the most out of mentors, was Evan someone who was incredibly, again, intentional about saying, "Look, I really want help. I understand where my strengths are, where my weaknesses are, and I really need help from you on X, Y, and Z"?
No, that was never that was never a conversation Evan and I had, nor was there a conversation around, which is I've sometimes been approached, but not with any conclusion, nor did Evan ever formally say to me, "I'd like you to mentor me," any more than you would say to somebody, "I'd like for you to be my friend." It was just that the two of us found that we really enjoyed each other's company. And as I mentioned earlier, we talked about a broad array of topics. Typically, at least 2/3 of the topics revolved around Snap, and it sort of played out from there. But no, there was never sort of like it wasn't set up in that way where one person is the mentor and the other person is the mentee, if that's a word. And, we had a scheduled rhythm and anything of the kind.
How did the relationship evolve when you became chairman? of Snap? And did you need to adjust the way you worked together at that later stage?
Well, the relationship already changed when we formed a board. So we Benchmark came into the company, I would say, sort of 1 or 2 years after Evan and I were originally introduced. And at that point, they insisted and were right to form a board. Of course, those board meetings at the beginning lasted all of 40 minutes because there wasn't much to discuss. It was just like the chart of where, the growth in users was going. But already then, the relationship at that point, there was a certain degree of formality. There was you had to cover certain topics. You had to make sure that we did things appropriately. There was a company secretary, albeit somebody from the outside taking notes and everything else. So yeah, it shifted slightly. When we eventually went off and formed a real board with me as chairman and took the company public, there's a whole other constituency, which is the board itself. So up until that point, my relationship was with Evan and with certain people inside the company who were direct reports to Evan, who he asked me to meet with on occasion. But once you have a board, now all of a sudden, and you're the chair of the board, part of the job is to actually manage the board, is to make sure that the board feels that it's getting enough information and that its relationship back into the chief executive is working well. And so it's a little less casual at that point between me and Evan.
Yeah, because it's unusual that mentorship or that sort of relationship would last all the way from startup to public company. But do you feel that your previous relationship with Evan allows you to contribute more effectively as a chairman?
I think what it allows me to do is, I should back up for a minute. Every company that I've ever been involved with, or every CEO of every company that I've been involved with, finds themselves on a pretty regular basis, but not necessarily in a crisis, not like the Sony hack by way of example, but certainly with a gnarly business issue. And if you have a really strong relationship with the chief executive, the role of chairman mostly exists outside of the boardroom. And you can have a level of intimacy in your conversations that can be really helpful there. So most of the conversation that you would have around those business issues don't happen in the boardroom, partially because, you only meet as a board 4 or 5 times a year. These business issues come up all the time. And at that point, you just pick up the phone and ask advice. And I think partially because we do have such a strong relationship, the ease with which either one of us would pick up the phone to the other one was there. And
reflecting back some earlier parts of the conversation, it seems like the relationship really grew out of a friendship, liking each other, and a mutual curiosity around discussing various intellectual topics. Is there anything else that's been core to the relationship that has allowed you to really have this almost more than a decade now, long-term relationship? Any other qualities?
Yeah, well, first of all, I should stop you by saying I don't think our conversations were always just around intellectual subjects. I think it ranged, cars, sports, you name it. I mean, it was pretty much across the board, honestly. Not like we were walking around the studio a lot talking about Kierkegaard and the future of Western democracy. That was not on the list. Maybe very, very
only on Fridays.
Yeah, only on the Fridays. But sorry, I missed the second part of the question.
I'm just wondering if there's any other qualities to your guys' relationship that's allowed it to endure and flourish over a decade plus. Sometimes the founder-chairman relationship can become quite strained.
I think it's really down to, I don't mean to sound trite. I really think it's down to a couple of things. I think it's down to whether you genuinely like each other and whether you genuinely trust each other. And the latter is probably the most important, because there are moments where you have to be, and those are not always very easy. You have to be really honest with one another as to how you see the world or how you see what's going on in the business. And obviously, people have different perspectives. I think that part of the key there is to be flexible and to be supportive, certainly toward the CEO. As I mentioned earlier in this talk, that's a lonely job. And oftentimes, particularly in a startup, let alone in a big company, you need reassurance that this stuff is going the way it should be going. But by the same token, and that's what I was sort of indicating earlier about the honesty part, there's plenty of times where Evan and I saw the world differently, where I said, gee whiz, I've seen this before, and maybe we should try something differently. But it never got to the point, and I think we were both very conscious of not letting it get to that place where we sort of got dug in and said, this is how it has to be. And so that, I think, is partially what prevented any kind of major blow up or a fracture in our relationship. And that's probably why it's lasted as long as it has.
Brilliant. Michael, if you zoom out a bit and think about mentorship more broadly, what do you think mentors get out of mentorship? And, in your case, it was obviously incredibly rewarding on so many levels. But at the beginning, there was no clear financial incentive. It was so not obvious that Snap was going to go on and become this huge success. But yeah, what do you think mentors get out of mentorship?
I can only speak for myself, obviously. One thing is when you get to a certain age, you like to be with people who are younger than you. Makes you feel young. That's, that's a certain piece of it. And I enjoy that. Part of it is it's fun, to be fair, to sort of teach, for me at least. I suspect for other people who try and do this kind of thing. It's fun to see sort of pattern recognition of things I had seen happen during my professional career and be able to say to somebody, gee whiz, you may want to think of it this way or that way. That's a part of it too. It does feel a little bit like you're giving back or being helpful. I will say, as somebody who has 3 daughters in their 20s, all of whom have their own careers, it is way, let me put it to you differently. As a parent, you're rarely a good guide in people's professional life. For one thing, your child doesn't typically listen to you, nor should they necessarily. For another, the nature of that relationship is way different than the nature of the relationship you would have with somebody that's either just purely professional or just purely friendship. And so with 3 kids who weren't always listening to what I might want to say to them, it's also nice to have somebody else who might want to listen. I'm going to be honest. And I suspect that's true of some other folks as well.
For sure. That definitely resonates.
Well, I think you've now led a few organizations, Michael, and obviously you've seen Evan leading his organization. Do you have any, stepping back, do you have any principles or lessons around leadership you could share with the audience today?
The typical ones are the typical ones, which is to say, and this took me a long time in my own life to understand, the organization looks to the chief executive to understand what true north is for the company in terms of behavior models, in terms of how decisions should be made, in terms of management style, all the rest. So I think the person at the top, the chief executive, one of the things you have to be aware of all the time, or, if you're not aware of it, it just comes naturally to you, is that you serve that role, and however you are behaving gets amplified through the organization. But that, I think, is pretty well known. I think the bigger issue, which is the one that I sort of talked about earlier, is that when you get to be in that job, it is absolutely critical that you make decisions. And I know that sounds like a ridiculous remark, but before that role, you're not necessarily responsible for all your decisions, nor do you have the ability to make the decisions that move the organization. And the reason why those decisions come onto the chief executive's desk is because that person is that now the buck stops here, as was famously said, at least here in America. And the thing you cannot do is get stuck deer in the headlights. as the chief executive, because that doesn't help anybody. And you have to recognize that when you're making those decisions, half the time you're going to be wrong. And you just have to be certain that the half the time you get wrong, you're not sinking the company. The more you do make those decisions and are decisive in that way, it sort of builds up a muscle. And you start to be more and more comfortable with taking on accountability for things like that. And I think that when you see a seasoned chief executive, that's what you see oftentimes. And people underrate that. And the thing that I encourage people to do in their professional careers is to get into positions in companies as early as you can, where you're making decisions and taking responsibility for those decisions, so that you can sort of build up that muscle memory over time.
No decision is a decision as well, I think, is one thing.
Yeah, but it typically doesn't get you very.
It's a decision hidden. But you've spoken about how Steve Burke, who brought you over to Disney, taught you sort of about the importance of decision making, which we've just discussed. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that story of how he conveyed that information to you.
I met Steve right out of business school. He hired me right out of business school into the Walt Disney Company. And Steve Burke is, in my mind, one of the, if not the best executives, not just in the entertainment business, but in any business I've ever encountered. He embodies all the qualities that I've described earlier: a person of high integrity, a person who really puts, always pretty much does the right thing. And he's not a person who dithers on decisions. And he never actually said anything to me with respect to that. I just observed it. I mean, when you came to Steve with a choice, he actually, virtually every time that I can think of, made a choice around that. He said, I think we should do this, or I don't think we should do that. Was he right all the time? Of course not. Nobody's right all the time. But he was never impulsive. He's never impulsive. He looks at the facts. He's objective in the way that he looks at things. And in that respect, I've always had Steve in my mind's eye, because he embodies that for me.
Michael, if you step back and think about Evan as a leader, what do you think it is and was about him that has made him such an extraordinary founder and then an extraordinary CEO as well?
I mean, I think what Evan combines, first of all, he's a young guy still, but when I met him, he was 20, 21 years old. And even then, and certainly now, he was way more mature than anybody I knew at that age. He had extraordinary gravitas, and obviously highly intelligent. But Evan mixes two things which seem contradictory. On the one hand, he is very decisive. He's a person who understands where he wants to take the company. And on the other hand, he's a person who's highly curious. He's always asking questions, trying to understand not just the company better, but the world better. And I think those two qualities really play out in him as the leader of Snap. The other thing, and it's very much part of the ethos of the company, is he's kind. He's a really kind person. And that plays out as well, importantly, inside the company. And, as a result, one of the other reasons I've been there as long as I have is, and I'm not sure, I can probably say it about other places, but there has never been a day or a moment where I have not been proud to be part of Snap. And in large part, that's because of Evan's leadership.
Amazing. We're going to finish. Cameron's going to ask you our question, which we ask every guest, Michael, which will make you blush a bit. But Cameron, over to you.
Sure. So what is it about you, Michael, that has made you be so successful in life?
Well, I don't know that I've been that successful in life. I don't know. I mean, I think in my day, not the case so much any longer. I was very driven. That certainly helps. And I wanted to build things, and I enjoyed running organizations and working with people. I think people could rely on me always to not necessarily make the right decision, but certainly make the decision that I felt was fair and appropriate in the moment. And I think there are two things, I guess. I think people trust me. What they hear me saying is what I believe and what I live up to. That's a certain part of it. And I think people, secondly, have fun working with me, quite candidly. So those two things in combination, I think, has been very helpful toward my career.
Well, I can add my own slight lens on it as we share a board now with Sesame, one of our giant portfolio companies. And I think you've always been a very incisive and I would say trusted voice in the board discussion. So I've seen it up close and could confirm that.
I try on doing it in a board is a little bit different than doing it as the chief executive, but I try as best I can on the one hand to be respectful of the management and the chief executive. On the other hand, when things are really need to be said, I'm oftentimes the person who says it. And as nice a way as I can, because sometimes it's not the best news, but I try and do that.
So we also try and always summarize a little bit at the end what we've learned on this Giant Ideas podcast. So I'll give it a crack. So the importance of friendship, and I would say trust in mentorship, the role serendipity plays, I think, in life and bringing mentors together. And then I think as a leader, whether as a CEO or otherwise, the importance of decisive and clear decision making. So Michael, thank you so much for sharing your giant idea with us today, the power of mentorship.
Thank you, Michael.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thanks very much.